Welcome, everyone, to the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar, at which, as you know, the seminar is co-sponsored by the Program on Negotiation and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. And this seminar happens also to be co-sponsored by the Canada program at the Weatherhead Center. So we're delighted that they are co-sponsoring this. Because our speaker was a fellow there from 2018 to 2019. So welcome back,
Thank you.
Ron. So let me just also say that I want to give thanks to our incredible team here of people who have put together this seminar. And honestly, it does take quite a team to pull off one of these wonderful discussions. We have Nicole Bryant, we have Diane Long, we have Lara San Pedro, and Lindsay Sullivan to thank for making all of this happen. So big thanks to my colleagues here. And I wanted to also tell you that this session with Ron Niezen is being recorded. So if you want to come back and take a look at it again or tell some of your friends about it, what you do is you go on the Program on Negotiation website, click on events, and you'll see the recording there. But that give us about a day or so for that to happen. And a little bit about the format. Professor Niezen is going to be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes, after which we will open it up for a Q&A with you, the audience. And would like to ask you to not put your questions in chat, but put them in the Q&A function. And then after Ron Niezen is finished with his presentation, we will take questions. And I want to apologize in advance because we never get to all of the questions. So yeah, we are really delighted to have our colleague Ron Niezen, Professor Ron Niezen, with us here today for these unusual times that we're going through here with our relationship with Canada. And I'm grateful to him for taking the time to be with us, to share his insights, give us a little bit of context and perspective, and perhaps even some thoughts about where we're going to be going with all of this. So let me introduce our distinguished speaker. Professor Niezen is a distinguished teaching professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of San Diego and a professor emeritus in anthropology at McGill University. He completed his doctoral degree in social anthropology at Cambridge University, for which he spent 10 months living and traveling in northern Mali, West Africa, and his first job after the PhD was with the Cree Board of Health and Social Services of James Bay, following which he served as assistant and associate professor of anthropology and social studies at Harvard, here at Harvard. He's the author of 12 books, including The Origins of Indigenism, Human Rights and the Politics of Identity, also Truth and Indignation, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Indian Residential Schools, and Human Rights, the Technologies and Politics of Justice Claims in Practice. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ron, and I'm going to go off screen until you're finished. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Kelman Center and the Weather Center for joint sponsoring this talk. What I want to do today is cover 4 main points. The first of these is that we're all shocked, of course. The reason that I have this word in the title is because we're shocked. But it isn't entirely new, and I want to go back into Canadian and British Columbian history in particular to make this point. I want to talk about Indigenous and state sovereignty and how they're connected. I want to talk about infringements of Canadian sovereignty and how they overlook the struggles and significance of Canadian sovereignty and the fact that Canada is a united country, and that these infringements I argue, underestimate Canada's resilience to resist. So the first point, shock and awe. You might be familiar to this with this from the Iraq War, and actually these were the words that were used to describe the new U.S. administration and its approach to bringing in a completely new policy program. To understand this better, I had a look at Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine. And she's referring to shock towards her conclusions, actually, as a phenomena where there's a gap between fast-moving events and the information that exists to explain them. So a part of what I'm doing today is slowing down a bit, going into the past, and maybe trying to undo a little bit of the shocking effect of recent developments and statements, of which we have several, right? First of all, we have a shocking statement that is about undoing this line of separation, so-called, between Canada and the US. In other words, the boundary, the border. And this is in the context of aspirations to include Canada, to fold it into the United States in defiance of its territorial integrity and international law. But then we have the sort of negative rhetoric, the use of the word nasty, Canada being one of the nasty countries to deal with. So this is language that is unprecedented, but the effort to include Canada as an appendage or to fold it into ambitions for the United States and its expansion are not new. And so I want to go back. I want to go back to the history of the province that I come from, British Columbia. But first, the idea that inspired this westward expansion and that inspired this inclusion of Canada, coming from the idea of manifest destiny, right? The idea of Canada joining the United States in a wider project. And here we have this statement of American Manifest Destiny in a famous painting by John Gast and by an address to the US Senate by William Gilpin, talking about the untransacted destiny of the American people to subdue the continent. The operative word here, of course, is the continent, which includes Canada and Mexico. And it acted upon this. I'm having trouble moving my slides. It acted upon this through, first of all, the westward expansion. So the language of this westward expansion was one of elimination of people that stood in its way. Here we have Frank L. Baum, whom you might know as the author of The Beloved Wizard of Oz in his very own Saturday Pioneer in 1890. And he's talking here about the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians that stand in the way of this ambition to push west and bring the country together without recognizing any indigenous peoples or any sort of differences. His descendants recently apologized to the Lakota for this statement. Closer to where I come from, I lived in for a number of years as a teenager in a trailer park about 2 miles from where I took these photographs a couple of years ago. And these photographs sort of show and represent the Fraser Valley Gold Rush, which took place in the interior of BC starting in 1858. The governor of the colony of British Columbia, James Douglas, sent an ore sample to San Francisco, and the word got out that there was gold in the interior of British Columbia. Almost overnight, 30,000 Americans descended on the town of Victoria, then a population of 500, and many more Americans. In the archives, in the BC archives, it's full of references to 49ers. And many of these came up through the interior of British Columbia. It came up illegally. They were supposed to go to Victoria first. So yes, British Columbia was subjected to a significant invasion of illegal immigrants from south of the border, and there was a significant amount of unrest that took place in the Fraser Valley Gold Rush as a result of this encroachment. And the Fraser Valley Gold Rush lies behind the founding of the province of British Columbia. It was the indigenous people of the interior, the Sepekemp, who held the worst effects of the Fraser Valley Gold Rush and the influx of American gold miners at bay. And in Ronald and Marianne Ignac's brilliant ethno-history of the people of the interior of British Columbia and their influence on its history, we have this notion that I want to delve into a little bit, that they were key to the sort of peacemaking, establishing their sovereignty, and creating conditions that made the founding of British Columbia and its inclusion in Confederacy possible. Canada wasn't a country until 1867, so this is occurring before Canadian Confederacy. And James Douglas, the governor of the British colony, was here reporting on the expulsion of the parties of gold diggers, and later, as the Ignaces report, thousands of miners had come up voicing their intention to annex the interior of British Columbia. And it is the indigenous people of the interior that actually held them at bay. They observed that, the Ignaces observed that the British colony had abdicated its duty to defend the boundary. The Americans simply came up, and it's because of a peace treaty that they negotiated with the people of the interior, with the indigenous people of the interior, that law and order was restored. And here's the key statement that I have put in italics. It was thus the action and intervention of the indigenous peoples of the area that maintained the Crown's sovereignty. We still have, at higher levels in the US government at this time, ambitions for the annexation of Canada. The Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, who served as Secretary of State in 1881 and again in 1889 to 1892, advocated for Canada's annexation. He hoped for what he said was a grander and nobler brotherly love that may unite, in the end, the United States and Canada in one perfect union. this is language that seems to closely echo what we see coming from the US government today. And then there's William McKinley, the famous William McKinley of the mountain recently renamed by the present US administration, who engaged in aggressive tariffs oriented towards territorial expansion, including territorial expansion to Canada. And McKinley's sort of his expansionist orientation includes the acquisition of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. But the main outcome of McKinley's tariffs were not the acquisition of Canada as the 47th state. As we know, of course, Canada sought other markets. So in a recent article in Time magazine, we have the observation that the US's loss was Britain's gain. The Canadian agricultural exports to Britain jumped from 3.5 million to 15 million. So trade that had normally taken place across the border with the United States went to Great Britain instead. Other markets were sought out, and there was resistance to the notion of punishing Canada with the goal of taking over the country. The McKinley government was also expansionist in some ways internally. The ironic, we see it as sort of ironically an act for the protection of the people of the Indian Territory of 1898 overturned treaties, abolished the governments of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee. So it was a kind of an aggressive government oriented towards American expansion and this idea of manifest destiny. Now I want to switch tracks and talk a little bit about what the relationship, what the U.S. government and others who favor the tariffing and annexation of Canada as a 51st state are overlooking, and that is the hard-won sovereignty in Canada. That it is an outcome of struggle, negotiation, and compromise. And I'm going to spare you the longer history and leap ahead to the Quebec referendum in 1980, which was an outcome of French resentment toward their pariah status in Canada. I've lived in Quebec for roughly 20 years, and the sense of Quebec difference is palpable, and it was certainly palpable when I was first there in 1987 in the aftermath of the first Quebec referendum, which was defeated by a vote of 40.44 in favor of Quebec secession to 59.56 no vote. But this didn't put an end to Quebec's aspirations for independence. We had another referendum in 1995. I was teaching at Harvard at this time, and my memories of this event are quite clear. It was looking at the results, which were not contested, were a little bit shocking how close it came. And you would think that after coming this close, that another referendum would eventually follow. But what followed was a period of negotiation and compromise on various fronts, to the point that Canada became recognized as a nation within a unified Canada, And as a nation, having various areas of sovereignty that it's able to exercise in distinction to other provinces. So it's a special sort of province in which French is the official language, and there is a great deal of control over things like immigration that you would not get in other provinces. But this close result, if we just look at the result, it overlooks the significance of the indigenous people in achieving that final result. Leading up to the referendum of 1995, the Crees and Naskapi and Inuit of Quebec organized themselves in opposition to Quebec secession. In particular, they organized themselves in opposition to their inclusion in an independent Quebec. So the Quebec separatists were arguing for the territorial integrity of a separate Quebec, whereas the indigenous people of northern Quebec, who were English speaking primarily, argued for their rights to self-determination, and in the exercise of that self-determination, decided that they did not want to be included in an independent Quebec. And they did this several months before the 1995 referendum by holding their own referenda. So the Grand Council of the Crees organized one in which this was the question: do you consent as a people that the government of Quebec separate the James Bay Crees and the Cree traditional territory from Canada in the event of a yes vote? They had helicopters flying into bush camps with ballot boxes. And the result was 96.3% no. The Inuit of Nunavik similarly engaged in a referendum. Do you agree that Quebec should become sovereign? The result was 96% no. These unambiguous results were the subject of newspaper stories and arguments that floated around leading up to the 1995 referendum, to the effect that the indigenous people of northern Quebec had a point. They could make the very same argument that Quebec was making about its right to recognition and the exercise of self-determination. And yet Quebec was denying them that right. I remember reading somewhere, and I'm afraid that I couldn't find it for this presentation, but the something like 5 to 7% of voters in the referendum were swayed or influenced by the result of the indigenous referenda in northern Quebec. At the same time, the Grand Council of the Crees had its lawyers put together something like 300-page volume on the Crees' rights to self-determination. And it's called Sovereign Injustice, Forcible Inclusion of the James Bay Crees and Cree Territory into a Sovereign Quebec. I was at the meetings of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in Geneva during this time, when Cree delegates showed up to the meetings with these volumes that they distributed to almost every representative of a home office at the United Nations that they could, to persuade them that their rights to self-determination were being infringed upon. And the goal of that was to influence an outcome of the Quebec referendum. So in short, and here we have indigenous delegates entering the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. This was part of a broader movement towards recognition of indigenous rights to self-determination. And Canada's resistance, initial resistance to the right to self-determination, was manifest in what I call the Battle of the S And the Battle of the S was surrounded the question of whether indigenous peoples were peoples with an S. That's part of the Charter of the United Nations. And you had to be recognized as possessing the rights that follow from that status. So there's no state as the members of the Charter of the United Nations. There are peoples. And so calling indigenous peoples peoples became very important. And during the working group meetings, Canada was resisting calling indigenous peoples peoples. They would use every word but peoples. They would use people in the singular, they would use groups, they would use Aboriginals, and so on and so forth. And whenever they did this, the indigenous delegates had 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper that they had marked with an S, and they would raise their S's. And this then became a focal point of indigenous claims to self-determination in the United Nations. That was another source of Canada's struggle and compromise in achieving its sovereignty. Subsequent to this movement, and parallel with it actually, is the negotiation of some of Canada's modern day treaties. So we have the Quebec movement towards self-determination and recognition of its sovereignty. But we also have many Indigenous peoples in Canada, 200 of which are in British Columbia alone. And some of these peoples had not negotiated treaties with the Canadian government. The lands that they claimed as Indigenous territory were resource rich. British Columbia still does not have territories that arrange formally the access to the territory that Indigenous peoples claim. And so there's this complication in British Columbia that remains, but in other areas, modern day treaties were negotiated. Here I have a map of what these territories and what the territories included in these negotiations encompass. So we have vast swaths of land that are now subject to modern day treaties and negotiation of regimes of self-determination. I was living in a community across Lake Manitoba around 2000 when they made a determination that they needed to exercise their right to self-determination. And so they passed a constitution. This had been done before my arrival. But when I was living there, they passed their own laws about hydroelectric payments. They passed an election law, and in the negotiations that followed from this, and this is not a direct quote, I'm doing this from memory, a Canadian official, and I'm sorry for the vagueness of the source, but a Canadian official made the comment, if we allow this kind of legislation, Canada would be like a piece of Gruyere cheese. He, of course, was corrected. The Gruyere cheese does not have holes, but he meant Swiss cheese or Emmentaler. There'd be constitutional holes all over the place, right? And in effect, he's correct. There is a complex web of sovereignty that was carefully negotiated with the Canadian government and with provincial governments as well. Now, the effort to overturn this simply by declaring the ambition of fulfilling manifest destiny and reviving this old rhetoric overlooks the hard-won sovereignty that is a part of Canada as a country. So what are the consequences of this rhetoric, of this ambition, of the tariffs, of the claims? One of them is rather startling. This is a survey that recently appeared in The Economist, with voters in the United States being influenced, apparently, by the rhetoric directed towards Canada. Even Democrats being, in some ways, persuaded by ideas of Canada being unfriendly or an enemy, right? Or nasty. And this is concerning to me, as it should be to many people who see this. These are images that were sent to me by friends in Canada. You don't even have the option of buying wine that is made in the United States. And this is the first time that I've ever seen a product advertised as not from somewhere. Not California purple yams, China grown in much smaller letters, right? So there has been a boycott, a popular boycott, an upswell of resistance to purchasing things produced by the United States, produced in the United States. Now, whether or not this has the desired effect on the US economy remains to be seen. And I'm sort of dismayed that both of these images that I'm finding target California, which is not the source of, the main source of the problem. But nevertheless, there is this very strong sentiment that's visually visible as you go about your business in Canada, and in particular here in British Columbia, where these images come from. And I know that my sample is small. I've only been talking to friends and family. But the sentiments that I encountered were, first of all, anger. How could they do this? And then resolve, with the popular meme, I think it was coined by Justin Trudeau before he left office, elbows up. This is a reference to hockey. Hockey being very important in Canada. And elbows up means that when you take somebody out on the boards, it's a kind of an unfriendly encounter, which you do with your elbows, and it can hurt a lot. So that is how Canadian resolve is expressed with a hockey metaphor. Very common is a feeling of mourning. We lost our best friend. And this is something that people feel deeply. And incredulity. How did this happen? What is going on? Now, what I didn't encounter, simply because of the people that I talked to, are those who are in favor, and they're mostly from Alberta. And there is a presence of the MAGA movement in Alberta. Alberta is an oil-rich province, so it has oil and cattle ranching. It's sometimes referred to as Canada's Texas, and it has the politics that reflect this. And it has people who, a minority of people who are all for it, like, oh yeah, okay, we can do that. There's resentment about oil pipelines not being constructed, and oil money that they do produce going east to Ottawa for distribution to the country as a whole. But even in Alberta, the farthest fringe of these ideas is a political liability for national politics. There is a rejection of those sorts of ideas in the national stage. And that is my last slide. I want to reiterate that this is nothing new, that there is a long history of these ambitions that became forgotten in the 80 years since World War II, when there was an entirely different regime of global governance and a different regime of relations between the US and Canada. It almost seems as though the memory of the Second World War has faded with the loss of that generation, and made room for the return of another more aggressive, more expansionist form of international politics. So I'll leave that there. I will stop sharing and open myself to whatever questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ron. I really appreciated putting it in this historical context. It was an education for me personally, so I thank you. And we have a few questions here. And the first one is from Louise Jewell, and she wants to know, in your opinion, what is the likelihood that the US will seriously engage in an annexation effort, and what needs to happen in the US government to pass this effort?
Oh gosh. And now we're in the area of international relations that I'm not an expert in. But I will say the Prime Minister Mark Carney, after his recent inauguration, the first thing he did was he traveled to France and Britain. And in France, he was asked this question. And he said, we don't need to really think about an American invasion seriously, if I understand the question. We're a member of NATO. It's not going to happen. And let's not go there. Like, it simply isn't. And that's the political response. That's the best I can do. I don't want to speculate about this on my own.
No, of course, Ron. All right, then this one you probably have an idea about, but what is the impact of all of your presentation on not all of your presentation, but what is happening in the relationship between US and Canada? What do you think is going to happen with the upcoming election?
Well, it was really interesting to me to see the reversal of political fortunes with the tariffs and with the talk of annexing Canada. Poilievre, who leads the Conservative Party in Canada, who's based in Alberta, was surging in the polls with the unpopularity of Justin Trudeau, and looked poised to win. His party looked poised to win the election and to put him in the office of the Prime Minister. But since the rhetoric of annexation, and since the application of tariffs and the sort of whipsaw effect of tariffs, like coming and going, and the instability of it and the insult of it, the political fortunes have been reversed. I think Mark Carney of the Liberal Party is 7 points ahead in the polls, leading up to an election on, I think, 28th. I just mailed my ballot not long ago. Now, your guess is as good as mine about what happens in an election. I can't predict elections, but I can point to that effect that, aside from a base of supporters, Trump supporters in Alberta, this policy coming from the US is very, very unpopular. It's political poison if you're associated with it on the national stage outside of a base in Alberta. So, that's my response to that question. Let's look at it closely.
Thank you, Ron. So here's another one, a question for you about considering the historical sovereignty shocks that you described and the provocative territorial rhetoric. How can international legal principles from the UN Charter and domestic constitutional frameworks in Canada and the US guide Canada's legal response?
One of the things that we've been seeing in recent years, and it isn't limited to the current American administration, is a decline in the rule of law. And I'm observing this decline with great concern.
Mhm.
And and this decline extends to climate action, it extends to international law, it extends to international relations, as we've seen. Um, and and so my answer to that question sort of hinges on um, takes it to the next level. Like, what can we do about the rule of law more generally? And I think the one thing that can be done about the rule of law is to oppose its violation as much and as courageously as we can. Um, Timothy Schneider, who recently moved to the University of Toronto from Yale, was adamant about this, referring to obedience in advance. Um, and we can't do that when it comes to the rule of law. I think that is where it has to stop. Once that's gone, there are no guardrails, and the ambitions that are made manifest in the rhetoric become possible.
Well, I think many of us would agree with you on that. And I mean, it is terrifying to think about the what would happen if the rule of law were, just destroyed. And I'm sure we have a great agreement here. It's just it's an absolute necessity in figuring out any of these dynamics.
Right.
So
Actually, the recent events at Harvard University are key to this. I actually see Harvard's position as very, very significant in this context.
yeah. Well, thank you, Ron. All right, here's another question. What do you think is a good step to follow? Retaliation, or do we sit down and talk and find common ground? What would you recommend?
Well, let's look at what happened when Columbia University acquiesced. It didn't lead to an agreement. It actually led to more punishment, right? So there's no guarantee that negotiation with this administration will lead to compromise and will lead to uh, sort of a stable result, right? It's shifting, and that's also manifest in the tariffs and how those have been rolled out and now are leading to sort of negotiation with each country that's being punished, and Japan receiving preferential treatment because it has certain resources and so on. It then becomes a process of piecemeal international relations and renegotiation of treaty agreements that were stable before, that the administration was actually responsible for. We had NAFTA that was then changed and so on. So what result? What do we do? Well, should you acquiesce? Should you punish with reciprocal tariffs? I'm not an expert in these areas. What I can point to is that um, there seems to have been some result from threats of tariffs, and that I leave it to the leaders of significant countries, especially like the European Union, a major trading partner, and Mark Carney in Canada, to make the right decisions, and I hope they do. But I will point out that based on what I've seen and what I've read in the news, compromise and a renewed agreement does not necessarily stay. It isn't fixed. It isn't stable. It isn't secure, and it doesn't lead to stability.
Well, this is kind of a follow-up to that topic too, but what kind of negotiation strategy might apply to such pressure?
Well, I here I'm a little out of my depths, as an anthropologist. But I honestly would say that the 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 notion of don't underestimate the idea of grassroots activism. Politicians respond, excuse me for that. Politicians respond to their base. Um, Canada's Canada's public has made very clear where it stands in the boycotts, and so that's leading to the politicians having some assurance that if there is economic pain that follows from a response to the tariffs, a forceful response to the tariffs, that the public would be behind them. So grassroots movements are not insignificant in this context, and I think can lead to a more effective negotiation strategy, at least certainly more options to political leaders.
So Ron, another question. Do you think, this is the question, do you think that President Trump is doing all this because he doesn't know the history? Or do you think he does know it and that's why he's doing this?
He renamed Mount Denali Mount McKinley. And I think he may be certainly aware of President McKinley and his history and the age of the robber barons and what could it be achieved through tariffs and so on. And I don't think he's aware of or cares about the history necessarily, the history of Canadian sovereignty as I presented it to you as a sort of an intricate web of negotiations. But the idea of McKinley being a reference point and having a portrait hung in the Oval Office and so on certainly is there, right? So I think that what we're witness to is a revival of that history and those ambitions of manifest destiny that have long been rejected and excoriated from our politics.
Okay, here's another. Thank you, Ron. Has this situation changed the relationship between Canada and other countries, for example, Mexico?
I'm not familiar with Canada and Mexico, but I suspect that if we look at this history of tariffs in the 19th century and Canada pivoting to Great Britain, we can see some of the same thing happening today. When Mark Carney was inaugurated, he didn't call the White House right away. He took a state visit to France and the UK, right? He met with leaders there. He talked about their future together there. And the situation hasn't been with us long enough for us to see trade policy affected by this. But my guess is that you may see that happening as well. So Canada is very likely, and here, I hesitate to be oracular about things, but here I'll make an exception. Based on what I've seen, Canada is very likely to look to other partners, right? And to look for other trade partners as well, and to sort of build a base of trade and finance that isn't quite so reliant on our southern neighbor.
And who might that be? Give us some examples of that.
Europe is a major trade partner, right? And the UK, and China, actually. China is a major trade partner with Canada, and above all with British Columbia and British Columbia's resources, natural resources. Yeah.
So what are British Columbia's resources that that China's interested in?
There's timber. I remember seeing coal trains going to Tawasin for shipment. Um, Something like several $trillion if you were to total it all up in British Columbia. Hopefully, you know, we don't want to see it. We don't want to see minerals and timber like used rapaciously at the detriment of British Columbia's beautiful environment. But
Yeah.
you know, those are the resources that that Canada has available. Alberta is lobbying, of course, for pipelines and being able to ship their tar sands oil internationally as well.
Okay, thank you. I find this question very interesting. Is there a place for international mediation to resolve this impasse?
I wish there were, right? But we've seen the sort of gradual erosion of the UN as a as an influence on international politics, and this concerns me. It's you know, we see the reluctance of states to to take the UN body seriously. We see the Security Council unable to deal with conflicts simply because of its mandate, which gives the permanent five countries veto power, even in the event that they're in violation of international law, and that has come up as a concern of the council.
Yeah.
This is a remnant of Stalin and his negotiation of the terms of the Security Council. So we have this to deal with, and again, part of the erosion of the rule of law that concerns me extends to not just international law, but the place of the United Nations in securing negotiation and recognition of its work. We want that to change.
Yeah, I'm just trying to imagine if there's another country, not necessarily the UN.
Now, you know, one just to follow up on that, you know, one thing that I'd thought about was truth and reconciliation commissions as a way of overcoming conflict, as you know, from the South African model. Like, what would have happened? This is going off topic a little bit, but what would have happened in the aftermath of January 6th if there had been a TRC instead of an exclusive focus on imprisonment of the participants? If they had come to the microphone, if people harmed had come to the microphone and talked about it, and if the UN had facilitated this and had a role in it, think how different things might have been in terms of public attitudes, right? But there seems to be an aversion to, especially in the US, an aversion to involvement of international bodies in domestic affairs.
Yeah. So this next question, for those of us who are Canada lovers and have many Canadian friends, what's your advice on good replies to Canadian expressions of "What's wrong with you Americans"?
Oh, I think most Canadians I've talked to, and this should have actually found a place in my slide, recognize that most Americans still appreciate Canada, if not love Canada, and see it as a friend and a partner, and that many of the attitudes that I mentioned in my last slide are shared with our American neighbors. So, you know, what to do? Well, you know, reach out, talk to them, but also voice your opinions and your discontent with the with American policy toward Canada in America. Like, call your representative, do what you can locally as well, and that would go, I think, a long way to mending fences where they've been broken.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's see, what else do we have here? As we look ahead to a new administration in 4 years, what can be done to repair the damage that is and will continue to be between the current administration and U.S.-Canadian relations? Can you imagine what would have to be done to repair this?
Well, I think the first thing to be said is that it might not be possible to repair everything right away. It would take a long time to repair everything and to restore trust. You can't restore trust with a change of government, like bringing in a change of government when the dynamics of American politics remain unchanged. How can you? Because there'll be another election and things will just return, right? So what needs to happen is a fundamental change in the way that politics are conducted, in the way that people permit politics to be conducted, and a change in the orientation, a fundamental change in the orientation that everyone can see, that there's no going back to tariffs and expansionism and rejection of the rule of law. That's what it would take. Whether that's what will happen, I can't tell you, but it's within our power to contribute to it happening.
Yeah, well, is there any role that just the average American could play in supporting Canadian sovereignty?
Well, I think the role is a domestic one, right? Canadian sovereignty is being threatened by US politics. So Americans have more power than Canadians do to change the shape and direction.
Yeah.
Um,
It's very hard, like the other previous question, for those of us who are, as shocked and as much in awe. It's very hard to sit quietly and not want to do something to ameliorate and to help heal this terrible wound. So, and finally, I think we probably have time for one more question, and I really like this. Are there strategies of resistance that Indigenous peoples have used to resist colonization? This isn't new to them.
right, exactly. This is one of the points that I wanted to raise. So, in some ways, being Canadian today feels a bit like it was to be Indigenous with the encroachment of the states coming from Europe to take territory and expand and gradually erode Indigenous sovereignty. And if you want, you can take heart from Indigenous movements that asserted their sovereignty while they, had power. And I use the example of the Indigenous peoples of the interior of British Columbia, who, even after devastating epidemics swept through, maintained their hold on sovereignty and maintained a certain amount of control over the interior of BC. Eventually overcome by a certain amount of state sovereignty, residential schools, and so on. But there it was. There was an assertion of sovereignty and a willingness to exercise it.
Yeah. Well, Ron, we're going to have to leave it at that. I thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today and informing us in such a insightful way of historical dynamics as well as what you think the current ones are. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to our colleague, Nicole Bryant. She's going to update us on upcoming events that PON is sponsoring.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you so much, Ron. We really appreciate your very thorough analysis and I, for one, certainly feel that I learned a lot about how the Canadian-US history shapes the current context. So thank you. And thank you, of course, to all of our participants tuning in from across the world. 250 people were with us today, and we are very grateful. A variety of events coming up for the program on negotiation. Amy Schmitz will be here talking about arbitration and a variety of justice tech projects on May 6th. And then we have Alexandra Vaucru joining us once again to talk about Ukraine with an update on the situation there. And finally, the PON Graduate Research Fellows, our 3 fellows for this year, will be presenting their works as they finish their doctoral dissertations at the end of May. We look forward to seeing you at one of our future virtual programs, or perhaps at an in-person or online course here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Thank you to everyone, and once again to the entire PON staff for all of their work in setting up this event today. Be well, and we hope to see you soon.